Welcome to this, the third evening in the inaugural Washington and Jefferson Symposium on Democracy. I want to add a special welcome to those who are viewing on live stream and those who may be watching the video recording of this evening's event. The symposium was conceived with the idea that we need, as citizens, to be in conversation on a continuing basis about the state of our democracy and about the responsibilities that we share for sustaining a healthy democracy, both in America and around the world, where democracy, in many cases, struggles to take root. Our founders understood this well, and in fact, our college was founded at the very time that our country came into being, right at the end of the Revolutionary War. And it was at that time that Washington and Jefferson College was founded not just as a college to prepare students for gainful employment, but as a college to prepare citizens, people who would ultimately make this new republic a success. And so this is part of our DNA, you might say. It is part of the mission that was given to us from the very beginning, well over 200 years ago. And this evening, we continue in that tradition with conversations that take us back to the beginning. We'll be thinking about the founding years of our republic, some of the early challenges that we faced as a republic, and how those might inform our thinking today. I'll say a bit more in just a few minutes at the conclusion of our program about what's on tap for tomorrow. But this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you a very good friend and someone that I believe we are very fortunate indeed to have on the campus of W&J. I first met our speaker a number of years ago at the University of Oxford in England. I was there, as I am each September, to lead a retreat for university and college presidents. Our host at Corpus Christi College was its president, Richard Cardwardine, who was also Pro-Vice Chancellor of the university. He showed us around the college, the room where the books of the King James Bible were translated from the original Hebrew manuscripts, the ancient library that Erasmus called the best in Europe. And as I got to know him, I learned that he is not only a generous and accomplished colleague, but that we share certain interests. He's from Wales, where I studied for my PhD. And he's a scholar of our country's history from the time of the Revolution through the Civil War. We've since developed a friendship that has brought us together over the years, both in the United Kingdom and the United States. And like so many others who know Richard, I have learned much from him, as I believe you will this evening. Richard Cardwardine is known the world over for his published works, especially his books on Abraham Lincoln. His scholarship is highly respected by his academic peers. He's a fellow of the British Academy and was Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford St. Catherine's College. And yet he has a knack for sharing his knowledge in ways that are accessible to the everyday reader. The New York Times calls his biography of Lincoln an illuminating and thoroughly intelligent assessment of Lincoln the politician. It's my personal pleasure to introduce Richard to my friends and colleagues at W&J. In recognition of his leadership in higher education and his contributions to public understanding of American history, our Board of Trustees has chosen to award Dr. Cardwardine the honorary degree Doctor of Letters. With us to present the degree are Dr. Judith Kirkpatrick, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Richard Clark, Chair of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you, John. Richard John Cardwardine, a son of Wales, an internationally recognized scholar of American history. You have contributed to public understanding of the early years of our republic and have given us new insights in the character of one of our greatest leaders, President Abraham Lincoln. You have shared your knowledge through numerous publications, including such noteworthy books as Evangelicals in Politics in Antebellum America, Abraham Lincoln and the Fourth Estate, The Global Lincoln, Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power, and Abraham Lincoln's Sense of Humor. You have been a leader in the field of higher education, having returned to your alma mater, Corpus Christi College, at the University of Oxford, to serve as president from 2009 through 2016. Your scholarly achievements have been recognized with fellowships at leading universities, the British Academy, the Royal Historical Society, the Learned Society of Wales, and with awards including the Lincoln Prize, the Arthur Miller American Studies Prize, and the state of Illinois' highest honor, the Order of Lincoln. Today, you have honored us with your participation and admiration in our inaugural Symposium on Democracy. And it is with great pleasure and honor that the Board of Trustees of Washington Jefferson College confers upon you the degree of Doctor of Letters, honoris causa.
Before I begin my talk, let me first acknowledge the great sense of privilege that I feel in being awarded this honorary degree by the college. I want sincerely to express my gratitude to the Board of Trustees through its chair, David Clark, and to your inspiring new president, John Knapp, my friend John Knapp, for what is a signal honor. I also want to thank the college for the warmth and courtesy of the welcome that you've given me yesterday and today. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, as I recall, had a few issues with us Brits. So it's nice to discover that that former unpleasantness has now been put to one side. I've entitled my talk "The Foundations of American Democracy," and it's a pretty impossible subject to cover in the course of 50 minutes, but I want to begin by saying that among the United States founding generation, there were no more eloquent and powerful defenders of the new nation's Republican purpose than the two figures after whom this college is named. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, by word and deed, were determined to embed in the independent American nation a system of political self-government capable of choking any political impulse towards monarchy or executive tyranny. Today, when democratic systems around the world are either in retreat or seeking to protect themselves against indigenous and external threats to democratic norms, it's especially appropriate to examine the founding ideals and practices of the American Republic. For it was here, in the United States, that the modern form of mass democracy, the first of its kind, sought its birth. George Washington's greatness was reflected both in the victory of his troops in the War of Independence and even more by his actions at its end. When King George III asked a visitor from America what he thought Washington would do when the war ended, he was told he would go back to his farm. Well, if he does that, the king said, in disbelief, he will be the greatest man in the world. But that, of course, is exactly what Washington did. The Britons and Americans familiar with the history of military usurpers from Julius Caesar to Oliver Cromwell, it was scarcely credible that a victorious general would voluntarily surrender his command to a civil power. As Jefferson put it, the moderation and virtue of one man probably prevented the revolution from being closed by a subversion of the liberty it was intended to establish. Washington declared in a letter to state governors in 1783 that Americans' next steps would determine whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse. The Union had to be strengthened. Otherwise, he prophesied, we may find by our own unhappy experience that there is a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny, and that arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness. The primacy of these concerns guided his subsequent decisions, agreeing to preside at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, accepting the presidency of the new nation, and reluctantly agreeing to serve a second term, before he again retired to his farm in 1797. And King George III once more expressed astonishment, saying that Washington's action made him the most distinguished of any man living and the greatest character of the age. Washington acted to prevent self-government in the infant republic falling prey to anarchy or military tyranny. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, provided an accompanying political manifesto. In his original rough draft of that document, he deemed that when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to subject the people to arbitrary power, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. The history of His present Majesty, George III, is a history of unremitting injuries and usurpations, all of which have in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. As Jefferson's most perceptive interpreter, the historian Peter Onuf has simply put it, the American Revolution was the central event of Jefferson's life. His rage at George III for his despotic violation of the imperial ideal meant that he was thereafter always on the lookout for monarchical tendencies that might subvert the new American regime, tendencies that his nemesis Alexander Hamilton seemed perversely delighted to display. As Jefferson fought the good fight against aristocrats and monocrats, his republicanism focused increasingly on the need for a virtuous and vigilant citizenry capable of defending its liberties against internal as well as external threats of despotism. That the subsequent history of the American Republic has been racked by racial slavery and its legacy has cast a long shadow over the founders' achievement. But bluntly, how should we characterize the birth of self-government and judge its exponents when we see them immured in the original sin of human enslavement? The question is not anachronistic, one posed with the benefit of hindsight. Contemporaries saw the irony, the contradiction. The English writer Samuel Johnson famously asked in 1775, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Washington's 8,000 acres and 5 farms at Mount Vernon were, at the time of his death, dependent for 90% of their labor on some 300 African-American slaves, about half of them owned by Washington himself, and the vast majority of them field laborers. The Mount Vernon website today concludes that Washington frequently utilized harsh punishment against the slave population, including whippings and the threat of particularly taxing work assignments. Perhaps most severely, Washington could sell a slave to a buyer in the West Indies, ensuring that the person would never see their family or their friends or Mount Vernon again. Washington conducted such sales on several occasions. And as we well know, Jefferson initially ran his Monticello plantation, 5,000 acres and 4 farms, with the slaves he had inherited from his father and son-in-law. At any given time, some 130 enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked there as farm laborers, artisans, and house servants. Jefferson made it clear that his first wish was that the slaves be, as he put it, well treated. But those who have examined the workings of the estate have concluded that he struggled to balance humane treatment with a need for profit. He tried to minimize the then common use of harsh physical punishment and used financial incentives rather than force to encourage his artisans. He instructed his overseers not to whip slaves, but his wishes were often ignored during his frequent absences from home. Washington has escaped the full force of modern censure of the founding generation's hypocrisy, of the gap between principle and practice, in large part because he was the only Virginia founder to free his slaves, which he did in the will he drew up during the final months of his life in 1799. It stipulated that the 123 slaves that he owned should be emancipated on the death of his wife, Martha. The will took effect in 1802. It provided for the support of young slaves until they reached maturity, and of the elderly and infirm for the remainder of their lives. His estate continued to pay out pensions for another 30 years. Jefferson's position is much more problematic. The author of one of the greatest manifestos of freedom in United States and world history, he is a victim of the chasm that separates his public role as the era's great apostle of freedom and the reality of his slaveholding, including, above all, the relationship with his slave Sally Hemings, who bore his children. The question that troubles even the most admiring historians is how to square Jefferson's private and personal practice with the principles of his Declaration of Independence, with his rhetorical assault on what he called the unremitting despotism and moral depravity of slavery, with his warning in the notes on the state of Virginia that whites would suffer God's wrath for their cruelty, with his advocacy of plans for gradual emancipation, including the ending of the international slave trade, and with his strictures against racial mixing, convinced as he was that white Americans and black slaves constituted two racially incompatible groups best separated by the deportation of emancipated slaves. Not even such distinguished Jeffersonian historians as Merrill Peterson, Peter Onuf, and Annette Gordon Reed have found it possible to identify closely with their subject at the personal level, given the impossibility of identifying the real man. We have to acknowledge Jefferson's personal weakness and his concealment of a private relationship that today, understandably, feeds the damning charge of hypocrisy. Now, my purpose here is not to mitigate Jefferson's sins by pointing to extenuating circumstances, namely that he was surrounded by a generation of equally great sinners, that he was not alone in facing economic and political realities that made it hard to live out his higher ideals. Such arguments have their place by encouraging posterity to take a realistic, not condescending view of the options open to the American founding generation as the slave economy tightened its grip. The case I want to make here, however, is that whatever Jefferson's undoubted shortcomings over questions of race and enslavement, we do him a profound injustice if we allow that disenchantment to blind us to his role as a political philosopher and practical politician, the proponent of a radically new form of government whose life and legacy shaped the political world for the better. For those who prize democracy and democratic values, I suspect that means most of us here, there are, I suggest, at least 4 ways in which Jefferson merits respectful attention. First, we should honor him for his role as arguably the single most influential facilitator of the rise of democracy in the United States during his lifetime. Second, his legacy, through the continuing influence and invocation of the Declaration of Independence, shaped the Union's political course towards sectional conflict and the Civil War's vindication of democratic government. Third, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was no mere local manifesto of popular sovereignty and self-government. It inspired many subsequent declarations of independence around the world and nourished democratic forces in a variety of global settings. Fourth, Jefferson regarded democracy as much more than a set of procedural rules for the organizing of politics. Rather, the rules were a means to the end of sustaining a virtuous republic. Democracy was about the nurturing of a good society and the moral populace on which its civic health depended. His particular understanding would lose its purchase during the 19th century, but this is not to say that it is without lessons for our own world, rife as it is with anxieties over the democratic deficit. So let me begin by considering Jefferson's role in the growth of democratic ideas and practice in his own time. As a subject, the growth of American democracy has been served by glittering historical scholarship for a century and longer. The most recent magisterial contribution is Sean Wilent's The Rise of American Democracy, which in the space of a mere 1,000 pages considers the most profound political transformation in American history, the triumph of the proposition, if not fully the reality, that sovereignty rightly belongs to the mass of ordinary, individual, and equal citizens. Willents describes that process as mysterious. After all, Western history for centuries had considered hierarchical societies to be the norm, and the people to be irrational, unstable, and dangerous. The Levellers and other agitating elements in the English Civil War of the mid-17th century marked some break with the past and prefigured later radical strands in American colonial thought, but these British expressions of insurgency were short-lived, and the American ones quite limited. As another recent historian of 18th century political practice, Richard Beeman, remarks, there was nothing inevitable or foreordained in the emergence of American democracy or in the speed with which it occurred. Most of the leaders of the American movement for independence were fearful of democracy. They were sure that government was best when placed in the hands of the propertied and educated. In a pre-revolutionary world of extraordinary diversity in the relationship between political leaders and ordinary citizens, most people would not have described political developments with the term democracy. That term was most commonly used alongside monarchy and aristocracy in arguments to show the dangers of unchecked democracy and the benefits of a mixed or balanced constitution. Eligibility to vote was restricted. Across the colonies in 1770, voting was limited to those over 21 years of age who held land or enjoyed an income from rents. Some colonies imposed religious tests. New York barred Catholics and Jews from voting. South Carolina restricted the suffrage to white Protestants. In Massachusetts, non-church members could vote only if they were, and I quote, not vicious in life. Property holding was widespread, of course, but by no means universal. In some areas, only 2 in every 5 white men met the property criterion. Moreover, those who were enfranchised did not necessarily exercise much political influence. In New England, town meetings often simply ratified decisions already made by local leaders. In embracing republicanism, few revolutionary leaders questioned continuing political leadership by the well-born. Conservatives like John Adams took alarm as they watched ordinary Americans organized in independent committees, raising a democratic clamor even before independence from Britain had been secured, and calling for a widened suffrage, equalized representation, unicameral legislatures, and a seemingly endless list of other egalitarian demands. Adams predicted, and I quote, "New claims will arise. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their claims not attended to. And every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state." Washington and Jefferson then did not set out as Democrats. Theirs was the world of Virginia gentry politics. Washington, as a young man, described the lesser farmers of the colony as the common herd of mankind. Jefferson, as late as 1776, complained a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom. But Jefferson's declaration, by asserting that all men were endowed with equal and natural rights, in a context where it was axiomatic that government should rest on the people's consent, provided a democratic instrument that would shape the political future. The revolutionary impulses surrounding the break with Britain by rejecting monarchical government challenged traditional hierarchical assumptions. But the course towards mass representative democracy would be stuttering and uneven. Most of the independent American states stopped far short of incorporating democratic ideals into their new constitutions in the aftermath of the Revolution. Government was still in the hands of the social elite. However, in a dramatic step that heralded a new era founded on Jefferson's precepts, a Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention in September 1776 produced the most radically democratic frame of government that the world had ever seen. Shaped by Ben Franklin and Tom Paine, it established universal freeman's suffrage to make the voice of the majority of people the law of the land. It also removed the upper house of the Assembly and reduced executive power. The leadership of a Quaker oligarchy yielded to a system ministering to a population increasingly diverse in its economic, ethnic, and religious makeup. Annual elections were introduced to secure a direct and immediate relationship between representatives and constituents. The Constitution's Declaration of Rights spelled out in stirring Jeffersonian terms that governments are instituted and supported for the securing and protection of the community, and that their primary purpose is to enable the individuals who compose it to enjoy their natural rights. The democratic impulses of yeoman farmers, urban artisans, and egalitarian evangelicals that found expression in the Pennsylvania Constitution made less impact elsewhere, though other states' constitutions widened the suffrage and democratized office holding. Philadelphia, in 1787, the drafting of a new federal constitution revealed the continuing tension between those who feared the licentiousness of democratization and those who nonetheless believed in the Jeffersonian axiom that sovereignty belonged ultimately to the citizenry. A conservative group included Alexander Hamilton, who wanted to see the rich and the well-born given a distinct permanent share of the government to guard against the turbulence of the masses. Drawing on the British model, he proposed a federal political hierarchy and an executive elected for life. The framers, however, did not go down this Hamiltonian route. Rather, the convention favored strong institutional filters on the powers of ordinary citizens. A president chosen by an electoral college, senators chosen by state legislatures. When Gouverneur Morris called for a property qualification for federal elections, Franklin invoked the virtue and public spirit of our common people, and Morris's proposal was overwhelmingly defeated. Following the establishment of Republican government under a new federal constitution, democracy remained fragile and inchoate. But during the 1790s, new forms of democratic politics emerged to express popular disenchantment with federal policy under Washington's administration. By the end of 1794, some 30 or so democratic Republican societies peppered the country from Vermont to South Carolina, populated by urban mechanics and yeoman farmers. These associations, these societies, celebrated the 4th of July, Jefferson's Declaration, and the Revolution in France. They and their networks of dissident editors warned of the trappings of royal government and the monarchical character of Hamilton's audacious reports on public credit, the national debt, and a national bank. They provided the essential elements for a formal political opposition, of which Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson would be the chief beneficiary. Jefferson's rural values, his Enlightenment faith in individual reason, his optimistic reading of humankind's potential for harmony and order, and a fear of government's natural inclination towards coercion made him suspicious of Hamilton's economic policies and their seemingly royalist character. He, James Madison, and their allies saw the democratic Republican societies, rural and urban, as a valuable means of reinforcing their efforts inside the cabinet and in Congress, aware that these societies were anomalous, independent political entities, extra-constitutional but not unlawful, vehicles for a continuing independent expression of the popular will, which could destroy systems of social and political deference that had survived the Revolution. By contrast, their Federalist opponents saw these societies as unbridled democracy that endangered the Republic. Democratic widening of American politics ensued, greater than anything Jefferson, Madison, and their fellow gentry oppositionists could have imagined in 1789. Jefferson, as I'm sure you know, stood as the candidate of the Republican interest in the presidential election of 1796 and came within 3 electoral college votes of defeating John Adams. The campaign and its outcome was a measure of how far top-down opposition politics had fused with the bottom-up activities of the democratic Republican societies. It presaged the majority coalition of city and country democracy outside New England that would take Jefferson to the presidency in 1800. An election that, for all of its fear-mongering and party polarization of Federalists and Republicans, vindicated the principle of legitimate opposition and witnessed a truly historic event, the peaceful replacement of one party of government administration by another. What followed during Jefferson's 2 presidential terms was not the implementation of the radical revolutionary program that his Federalist enemies predicted, nor did he act wantonly to betray his party's principles and civil liberties, as anti-administration Republicans alleged. The course he followed was, however, accompanied by a broadening of popular participation in politics. In Willence's view, Jefferson and his party vindicated the political equality of the mass of American citizens, the ordinary vote, the poor, ragged Democrats, as one New England Republican put it. By the time Jefferson died in 1826, the right to vote had been extended very generally to include all adult white males, particularly spurred by the admission of new Western states into the Union with constitutions that imposed no property qualifications on voting. Historians once misleadingly talked about the arrival of universal suffrage, hardly, given that almost all women and black persons had no access to the ballot box. By the 1820s, too, a new breed of politician, typified by the humbly born Martin Van Buren in New York, upstate New York, had seized the initiative in politics, leading a movement committed to the novel proposition of party loyalty rather than wealth or family distinction should be the basis on which voters should cast their ballots. When the old guard pleaded for respect for the dignity of traditional families, their opponents derided their failure to see that the course of things in this country is for the extension and not the restriction of popular rights. The new men took it as axiomatic that the great fundamental principle that all men were equal in their rights was settled, forever settled, in this country. It had not been fully settled, of course. In the old South, pockets of elite-dominated politics continued into the 1820s and 30s, and indeed beyond. Governance in South Carolina would have a distinctively elite flavor right up to the Civil War. There, the wealth of planters and merchants continued to shape representation in the state assembly. And those who tried to secure the popular election of the governor were consistently thwarted. Jefferson's Enlightenment rationalism stirred in him a faith in incremental human progress and a belief that after his death, the democratic values to which he had given expression would continue to shape the Republic for the better. He was certainly right that the Declaration of Independence would enjoy a resonant afterlife. Some of his political heirs carried its themes of popular sovereignty and democracy into the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, compromised though it was by its devotion to a states' rights doctrine designed to maintain slavery in perpetuity. Ironically, however, it was not a Jacksonian Democrat who played the most significant role in making Jefferson's text an instrument of radical democracy. Of those who saw the democratic potential of Jefferson's document and its principles, none was more influential than the anti-Jacksonian Democrat, Abraham Lincoln, a Whig Republican. There is, I think, some irony in Lincoln's role as the torch carrier for Jefferson's egalitarian principles. Whether or not Lincoln's law partner Billy Herndon was correct when he claimed that Mr. Lincoln hated Thomas Jefferson as a man as well as a politician. Lincoln was no admirer, whether or not he was right in saying that, Lincoln was no admirer of the agrarian order that Jefferson championed or of the slaveholding class to which Jefferson belonged. And there is a strong basis, evidence, that Lincoln knew about, believed in the rumors of Jefferson's sexual liaison with his slave Sally Hemings. And it's clear, undoubtedly clear, that Lincoln was scornful of the Virginians' double standards. Lincoln described himself as naturally anti-slavery and told a Kentucky editor in 1864 that he could not remember when he did not so think and feel. This lifelong conviction that slavery was wrong was one element in Lincoln's faith in America's potential for economic dynamism. He had a vision of an enterprising, commercially prosperous nation in which every citizen would seize the chances presented by a fluid and expanding society. At the heart of his agenda, as an aspiring Whig politician in the 1830s and 40s, were the elements of Clay's famous American system. National banks, protective tariffs, better roads and waterways for transporting goods. These would be the means of speeding the transition to a market economy, offering encouragement to poor farmers and mechanics to better themselves, as he had done. The logic of Lincoln's economic thought dictated a social and moral order at odds with Southern slavery. All men, he insisted, black and white, should be free to enjoy the fruits of their own work. Free labor offered the prospect of improvement in condition and kept the social order fluid. Slavery, however, stifled enterprise in both planters and slaves and sustained a fundamental inequality, depriving human beings of the just rewards of their labor. Now, in 1854, Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealing the Missouri Compromise of 1820, opened up the Western territories to slavery's expansion. From a position of historical defensiveness, with every prospect of ultimate extinction, slavery now appeared likely to swamp the nation. The Nebraska Act set Lincoln on a course that would culminate in his election to the presidency in 1860 as the candidate of the Republican Party grounded on the principle of quarantining slavery. His rhetorical assault on the institution evinced a new and sharp moral edge. His argument drew especially on the doctrines of natural rights and human equality set out in the nation's founding text and above all in the Declaration of Independence. Whatever Lincoln's view of Jefferson the man and slaveholder, he honored him as, and I quote, the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness to introduce into a nearly revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. Lincoln wrote those words in 1859. He'd just been invited to a July the 4th birth banquet in Boston. He was unable to go, but he took the occasion to restate the essential position that he had repeated over the previous 5 years. The principles of Jefferson, he said, are the definitions and axioms of a free society. The central idea of our political public opinion at the beginning was, and until recently has continued to be, the equality of men. And although it was always submitted patiently to whatever of inequality there seemed to be as a matter of actual necessity, its constant working has been a steady progress towards the practical equality of all men. Lincoln was adamant that he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. What profoundly troubled Lincoln was that the central proposition of Jefferson's document had become a divisive axiom. Near 80 years ago, Lincoln said in his celebrated Peoria speech, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now, from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. He cited those who disparaged the Declaration of Independence as a self-evident lie, as many did, or declared, as did Stephen Douglas, that it did not apply to black people, but only to superior races. Citing these when he talked about this revolutionary feeling. And in a telling climax to a speech in Chicago on a hot July evening in 1858, Lincoln revealed an underlying radicalism. Where would making exceptions to the Declaration of Independence stop? And I quote, If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. To cries of "no, no" from his audience, he continued, let us stand firmly by it then, the Declaration of Independence. My friends, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. Lincoln reflected on the irony that since the days when Jefferson's Republicans had battled against Adams' Federalists, those parties' successors had switched their positions on Jefferson's fundamental principle. Those claiming political descent from him have nearly ceased to breathe his name, Lincoln said. The Democrats of today hold the liberty of one man to be absolutely nothing when in conflict with another man's right of property in slaves, while Republicans, on the contrary, are for both the man and the dollar. But in the cases of conflict, the man, the slave, before the dollar. I remember Lincoln recorded once being much amused at seeing two partially intoxicated men engage in a fight with their greatcoats on, which fight, after a long and rather harmless contest, ended in each having fought himself out of his own coat and into that of the other. If the two leading parties of this day are really identical to the two in the days of Jefferson and Adams, they have performed about the same feat as the two drunken men. It was not, Lincoln more soberly concluded, going to be easy to save the principles of Jefferson from total overthrow in this nation. One calls them glittering generalities, another self-evident lies. These expressions are identical in object, the supplanting of principles of free government. They would delight a convocation of crowned heads plotting against the people. We must repulse them, or they will subjugate us. Democratically elected to the presidency in November 1860, Lincoln was appalled by the constitutional breakdown that ensued as the slave states hurtled towards secession. He'd always recognized that the vulnerability of the American Republic experiment lay at home. In his much-quoted Lyceum speech of 1838, he asked, shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. The danger cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide. Lincoln accepted war, as we know, in 1861, rather than acquiesce in a breakup of the Union, in order to uphold a form of government unique in human history. Most governments, he reflected, have been based practically on the denial of equal rights of men. Ours began by affirming those rights. We proposed to give all a chance, and we expected the weak to grow stronger, the ignorant wiser, and all better and happier together. When, during the war, he spoke of the Union as the last best hope of earth, he cast the Civil War as something larger than an American crisis. The heart of the struggle with the Confederacy lay the future of representative, democratically elected government throughout the globe. Conflict was a people's contest which would resolve the question of whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. The rebels, he noted, had omitted from their declaration of independence and Confederate Constitution the words, all men are created equal, and the phrase, we the people. It had removed from view the rights of men and the authority of the people. The democratic significance of the Civil War lies in more than Lincoln's mobilization of the Union to put down an anti-democratic rebellion. It lies equally in the persistence of democratic practice, with few exceptions, throughout the 4 years of war across most of the loyal Union. The war, of course, severely tested the routine and the stability of democratic politics. Both military and civilian authorities often bore down fiercely on those whose loyalty they doubted. However, the erosion of democratic practice was only one part of the story. The more powerful narrative is that of the remarkably robust survival and of democratic politics and its role in ideologically energizing the Union cause. On average, a significant congressional or state election occurred every other month during the 4 years of the Civil War. But the greatest test of American democratic institutions would come with the presidential election of 1864. One of the most unshakable constants throughout Lincoln's career was his profound faith in the wisdom and good sense of the majority of voters. During the war, the common citizen's voluntary exercise of reason, he believed, would provide the bedrock of support for the Union and its armies. Americans, he said, had a fundamental idea going down about as deep as anything, the survival of constitutional government to rally and unite them. And in the dark days of 1864, he professed his continuing faith in the people. Let them know the truth and the country is saved. So Lincoln saw his return to office by a popular vote in November of 1864 as a defining episode of the war. A quiet and orderly election had revealed the essentially non-coercive genius of the Union's three institutions and the nation's capacity to function even in wartime without running into anarchy or despotism. Here was the evidence of the resilience of the nation's democratic forms and representative government, and confirmation to the world at large that popular government had a future. And a chorus of foreign voices helped to nourish Americans' self-perception as the agents of a unique national mission. The French historian Henri Martin contemporaneously cast Lincoln as the agent of the final victory of modern civilization. Lincoln's re-election would gloriously re-energize the cause of European progressives, dashed in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848. He wrote, the grand type of representative government without the corruption of the Middle Ages, with a state church or a hereditary aristocracy, as in England, will reappear in all its splendor. Martin assured his American brothers that millions of men in Europe vote in their hearts with you for Lincoln. So the onset of the Civil War had marked the failure of democracy. Remarkably, counterintuitively, the war itself did not hasten the death of democratic government, but gave democratic processes and Jeffersonian norms special relevance and vigor. I promised at the outset to consider 4 ways in which Jefferson merits our respect. Under the third heading, the broader influence of the Declaration of Independence, I shall do no more than very briefly note that the document was no mere local manifesto of popular sovereignty and self-government. As the Harvard historian David Armitage has shown in a sparkling book on its global history, the document inspired many subsequent declarations of independence around the world. Jefferson, in 1776, had no previous models to guide him. He had to rely on his own forensic and rhetorical skill to craft his declaration. But once published, it rapidly entered national and international circuits of exchange. Jefferson's formulation became a model for the world. Its subsequent global proliferation in well over 100 settings in Latin America, Europe post-1918, decolonizing Africa and the Far East. Its subsequent proliferation reveals a variety of uses that reflect the competing imperatives at the heart of the Declaration itself, between peoples and states, and between the individual bearers of rights and the sovereigns who claimed their own rights against other sovereigns. By no means all of these declarations of self-government championed democratic principles, but many of them did. Jefferson should earn our appreciation and respect for the role his masterpiece played in nourishing aspirant democratic forces in many different settings around the world. My fourth and final point in appreciating and praising Jefferson's own contribution to democratic practice is one that is, I think, particularly relevant to discussion about the robustness of democracies today. For Jefferson, democracy was more than a set of institutional arrangements and procedural rules, more than a question of who should vote and the mechanisms by which they should do so. Above all, it was about the sustaining of a thriving Republican society and moral order through the encouragement of civic virtue. As the Harvard political philosopher Michael Sandel reminds us, we should not read back into the founding era the same political approach to economic issues that we find in contemporary America. Today, those arguments revolve mostly around issues of prosperity and fairness, on the size and distribution of the national product, tax rates, government spending, regulation. In the early republic, however, debates on economic policy addressed their civic consequences. They asked a different question: what economic arrangements are most hospitable to self-government? And Jefferson was a key shaper of this debate. The classic expression of the civic implications of policy appeared in his notes on the state of Virginia, where he argued that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, embodying genuine virtue. Since the agrarian way of life was the root to virtuous republican citizenship, government policy should aim to restrict the growth of large-scale manufacturing at home and let the moral corruption it promoted stay embedded at a distance in Europe. The bobs of great cities add just so much of the support of pure government as saws do to the strength of the human body. It is the manner and spirit of a people which preserve a republic in vigour. A degeneracy in these is a canker which soon eats out the heart of its laws and constitution. For their part, Jefferson's contemporaries who sought the advance of domestic manufacturing also made their arguments in terms of liberty and virtue, not as we would today in terms of economic growth. Worried by the consequences of luxury and dependence for self-government, they sought to limit foreign trade in finery and luxury goods that threatened to corrupt the moral character of Americans. The chasm between those who wanted to maintain the integrity of the young nation's agrarian character and those who advocated domestic manufacturing shaped the politics and party alignments of the early decades. It was widely understood that self-government required civic virtue among all orders and degrees of men. Thus, the public life of a republic had a primary role in the formation and cultivation of moral citizens. For Madison, the point of republican government was not to give the people what they want, but to do the right thing. When he became president, Jefferson aimed to restore the republican simplicity he saw jeopardized by Hamilton's financial measures. He and then Madison, over their 16 years in the presidency, pursued policies designed to buttress civic virtue. Purchase of Louisiana added a vast tract that would preserve the agricultural way of life and foster virtuous citizenry. We can, of course, and should note that over time Jefferson came to see that domestic manufacturing too was necessary to national independence, but in doing so did not renounce the political economy of citizenship that had shaped his agrarian vision. Jefferson's agrarian vision did not prevail, but the Republican assumption underlying his economics found broader support and a longer career. From the Revolution to the Civil War, the political economy of citizenship played a prominent role in American national debate. Thus it was that Lincoln, who dismissed Jefferson's agrarianism, did not quarrel with the conception that underlay it, that economic developments should be judged by the moral and civic benefits that they would bring. His advocacy, first the Whig and then the Republican Party's economic programs, was moved by a recognition that they would be morally uplifting and encourage the virtues and self-discipline and self-control. By the middle of the 19th century, American manufacturing had become a reality. It brought with it the question of whether working for a wage was consistent with freedom. Such work might be in some sense voluntary, but it did not fulfill the Republican conception of free labor. Persons were truly free only so far as they participated in self-government, and to participate they required the qualities of character bred by economic independence. But those who subsisted on wages paid by employers were unlikely to have the moral independence to judge for themselves as free citizens. The historian Daniel Rogers notes the Jeffersonian conviction that political liberty was safe only when no man was economically beholden to any other died hard in America, and in the 19th century it still had considerable force. In the minds of most Northerners of the Civil War generation, democracy demanded independence, not only political but economic. The civic understanding of free labor was central to the appeal of Lincoln's Republican Party. The spread of slavery into the West had to be stopped because slaveholding would destroy the free labor system and the self-governing citizenry on which a healthy republican democracy depended. Lincoln saw wage labor as a temporary step on the way to the full economic independence of free labor. He recognized no danger of a permanent proletariat. There were, he believed, no insuperable barriers to the social progress of any free, enterprising, and conscientious man, drawing, of course, on his own personal experience. Southern slaveholders, he noted, think that men are always to remain laborers here in the North, but there is no such class. A man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself. Next year, he will hire laborers and others to labor for him. 20 years ago, the political philosopher Michael Sandel published a brilliant book, Democracy's Discontents, in which he examined the distrust of the United States government and the perceived shortcomings of American democracy in the 1990s. The fear that individually and collectively we are losing control of the forces that govern our lives, and the sense that from family to neighborhood to nation, the moral fabric of community is unraveling around us. Sandel's book has lost none of its relevance with the passage of time. If anything, the issues that he identified have become even more disturbing and challenging. Finding today's prevailing ideas of the role of the state as no more than a morally neutral arbiter amongst contending plural interests to be dangerously shallow, Sandel asked his readers to find a remedy in the resurrection of the civic republicanism that had given such meaning to Jeffersonianism and to Lincolnian understandings of democracy. The respect for individual rights and the conception of people as free and independent selves, unencumbered by moral or civic ties they have not chosen, shapes our ideas of freedom on which modern democratic politics operate, is part of our predicament. It cannot, Sandel says, cannot inspire the sense of community and civic engagement that liberty requires. Now, Sandel recognizes properly that there was no golden age when all was right with American democracy. The Republican tradition coexisted with slavery, with the exclusion of women from the public realm, with property qualifications for voting, with nativist hostility to immigrants. However, the civic-minded democracy that Jefferson and Lincoln fostered offers a way of asking questions that have long gone out of fashion, but which might with profit be posed again. Above all, what economic arrangements are hospitable to self-government? Well, whether or not we are persuaded by Sandel's arresting prescription for the recovery of active, republic-minded citizenship, members of this academic community here at Washington Jefferson College should take heart from the sources that inspire him. Means of rescuing today's ailing democracy may still be sought and found in fundamental features of the political philosophy espoused by the founders after whom this college is named. Thank you for your attention.
Richard, I know I speak for all of us when I say that we are grateful for that brilliantly crafted and delivered lecture. And you have deepened our appreciation and understanding of democracy and our own history, to which we are all heirs. We will have an opportunity to talk further with Richard Cardwardine tomorrow. At lunchtime, he'll be delivering a lunch and learn talk over at the ballroom on his new book, Abraham Lincoln's Sense of Humor. I hope some of you will plan to join us there. I think you'll enjoy that conversation. Books will be available as well. If you find the talk interesting enough, he'll sign one for you. And then tomorrow evening, he'll be with us, and we'll be in the ballroom again for a panel discussion. He will be a member of that panel, as will three of our best and brightest from here at the college. And we'll be having a conversation about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and how do we view them from a 21st century perspective. It will be a fitting way to end a very, very productive first symposium on democracy here at the college. So I thank you for joining us this evening. I know that you have been as illuminated and inspired as I've been by Dr. Carwardine's lecture. And if you would, as we leave, just join me in thanking him once again for the good work he's done in bringing his wisdom to our college.